The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar for the month of April 2018. Tonight's topic is a very special and important one. It's not liberty, the creeping menace of religious discrimination. So first we'll introduce your hosts. The first voice you hear is myself, Erin Matson. I am one of the co-founders and co-directors of Reproaction, and I'm based in Arlington, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C.
And this voice is Pamela Merritt, and I am the other co-founder and co-director of Reproaction, and I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri.
Awesome. So an agenda for tonight, we'll start by introducing Reproaction. Then we'll talk about how it's never been about liberty, no matter what the religious right says. From there, we'll move to our panelists. First, we'll talk with Lori Bertram Roberts, who's the co-founder and executive director of the Mississippi Reproductive Freedom Fund. Next, we'll be joined by Steph Perkins, who is the executive director of Promo. We'll do next steps, Q&A, and adjourn by 8 Eastern, 7 Central sharp. If you have questions at any time during the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. And the hashtag for live tweeting tonight is Reproaction. All right, so first, a little bit about our group. Reproaction is a new direct action group forming to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are so proud of our left flank analysis. We are known for our willingness to hold folks on all sides of the issues accountable, whether they're traditionally considered allies or opposition. And we have a commitment to nonviolent direct action as one of the tools in our toolbox. And with that, I'll pass it to Pamela.
Thank you very much, Erin. So, as Erin said, this is such an important topic and one that I know has been top of mind since the election of Donald Trump. But in reality, this has been an issue that really is foundational to the United States of America. The friction between religious freedom and civil rights really is as old as this country. I grew up with civil rights era parents in St. Louis, Missouri, and my mother was born in 1942. And my grandfather was stationed, that was during World War II, so he was stationed in the Navy in California, and he traveled back to Mississippi where my mother was born. And my parents would tell me this story all the time about how he had to travel out of uniform because it was actually dangerous for him to travel in 1942 in the Deep South in uniform, and people thought he would be putting on airs, and it was like literally dangerous to his life. There were policies, there were custom, and then there's really law and guiding principles for communities that used religious freedom and the language of religious liberty to deny people civil rights that date back as far as slavery. Religious liberty was used to deny women suffrage. It was used as an argument for why women should not have equal education or even be educated. It was used to deny people of color, unmarried women, as the term was, property rights. It was used as a justification for segregation. And as the story was told in my family, I can't tell you actually how many times I've heard people reference the curse of Ham, which is a biblical reference that was used to justify slavery and to justify segregation. Religious liberty was used to deny people marriage rights, both the right for people who were Catholic to marry people who were Protestant, and then obviously, as we know from the Loving case, religious liberty was actually used to deny people the right to marry somebody of a different race. And then it's been used as a conscientious objection, most notably during World War I and World War II. The government actually struggled with people who said they did not want to fight in war. And then it has been used both as a weapon to deny people access to services and public accommodation if they are LGBTQ and are in this country. Next slide. So it's really true that it's never been about liberty. And as somebody who is a Black queer woman, it is very important to me to talk about the intersections of how this is not about liberty and how this really impacts our lives. When people talk about religious liberty, it is a very hard, as an American, we're kind of conditioned to think, oh, that's important. That's something we need to protect. And in reality, the creeping menace of religious liberty policies has made its way into our hospital systems. As Amy Littlefield wrote in her Rewire article, women of color are more likely to give birth in hospitals where Catholic beliefs hinder care. Lori is going to talk about that with Aaron a little bit later, but a lot of people aren't aware that their hospital might be affiliated with the Catholic Church or with another religious institution, and those religious institutions can actually govern your care. And then they even extend beyond what we have been conditioned to believe are the areas of religious exemptions. So, for example, in the state of Missouri, there is a religious exemption in the autism insurance bill. This shocked me. My older brother has autism, and I was thrilled when we passed a bill that said that people had to get coverage for services and care that are related to an autism diagnosis. But then I heard that there was a religious exemption. And the only time, actually the first time, that the religious exemption in the autism insurance law was used was by St. Louis University High School, which is a Catholic high school, to deny coverage to the child of two teachers who had been diagnosed. And they said that they were denying the care based upon their religious exemption because the insurer was a religiously affiliated insurer. I cannot think of any religious objection to people with autism, but that's how it can be used, and that's how far it can extend without people even being aware that it has been inserted into policy. Aaron?
All right. Thank you, Pamela, for that powerful introduction. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first panelist, who we're very pleased and honored to have with us tonight. Lori Bertram-Roberts is the co-founder and executive director of the Mississippi Reproductive Freedom Fund. A reproductive justice-centered organization, Mississippi Reproductive Freedom Fund is the only state-based abortion funding source in Mississippi. The Mississippi Reproductive Freedom Fund provides direct funding for abortion access as well as practical support, funding emergency contraception and birth control, and provides inclusive community-based sex education. While working on broad-based reproductive justice work intersecting with racial, gender, labor, and youth justice issues, Ms. Bertram-Roberts has been protesting, advocating, and engaging in political work and grassroots activism since her teens. She has appeared in many local, national, and international media outlets discussing abortion access, birth justice, LGBTQ rights, and women's issues in Mississippi. She often writes and speaks about her personal experience being a teen parent, living in poverty, surviving rape, sexual abuse, and domestic violence. When not working, writing, or tweeting, she is likely spending time with her mom, beloved partner, and 7 kids who, like her, love all things creative, sci-fi, and geeky. Lori, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You know, it's my pleasure. I love you guys.
We love you back so hard. Okay, so first, Pamela just mentioned how Rewire wrote about your experience at a Catholic hospital in Indiana. It's a really compelling story. And Lori, I'd like you to walk us through your story here. So my first question for you is just simply leaving the Catholic hospital piece out of it. Why did you go to the hospital that day?
Yeah, so actually that day was the third time I had been to the hospital in like less than 36 hours. So I had woke up like a day and a half before that with pink discharge. I was 12 weeks pregnant. I had went to the ER. They told me, hey, you might be having a miscarriage. Go home, put your feet up. We don't know, but, go home. And I was uninsured at the time. It's funny because when I first started telling the story, I thought I was 18 at the time, but I was actually 17. And I was young. I was married, uninsured, worked 2 jobs. So I go home. I put my feet up. I rest. And they were like, if you start bleeding heavily, come back. So I started bleeding heavily. I came back. They did an ultrasound. They were like, hey, your fetus has a light heartbeat, so there's nothing we can do for you. So sorry, you're having a miscarriage. Go home. And they sent me home. And within several hours, I was bleeding really heavily, and I mean heavily. And that's why I ended up back in the ER, because I ended up passing out. I was hemorrhaging. And I passed out on my mother's kitchen floor, and they had to rush me to the ER in shock.
Mm.
So like that's a condensed version.
Oh my goodness, it's just unconscionable. So they literally almost killed you.
Exactly. So they could have given me options. They could have told me, hey, you have an option to go to the next city over and possibly get a DNC if you want it. Here's how you can choose, if you choose to want to manage your miscarriage, because there is miscarriage management by wait and see, right? But like, they didn't give me any options. They didn't properly wait and see. I was already bleeding heavily when they sent me home. It was just, your fetus has a heartbeat. It doesn't matter that it's non-viable. It doesn't matter that we already told you that it wasn't growing properly. This fetus has a heartbeat. So you're not more important than the fetus. Go home. Have a nice day. And when I came back, hemorrhaging, my family doctor was actually in the ER as the doctor staffing the ER. Michigan City, Indiana is not that big. And about 30,000 people. And he was screaming at the staff saying, who the F sent her home? She could have died.
Lori, how did you choose the hospital when you first went? You mentioned that you hadn't considered about the hospital in the town over. At the time, were you aware that Catholic hospitals operate under religious directives that restrict access to care? And in particular, in this situation, of course, the fact that they were not doing miscarriage management because of their objections to abortion?
Absolutely not. And what's really funny is at the time, I was like so still pro-life. I was like I grew up very conservative, and I was very much still a very pro-life person. At least I considered myself that way. But I had no idea. And the thing is the Catholic hospital there is the hospital. Like, even when there was a smaller public hospital open, nobody went there. Like, you went there if you had like a stub toe. You didn't go there, like, if you had an emergency, you didn't, you know what I mean? Like, that wasn't the hospital you went to. And then I also grew up in a family where when I was growing up, my family used to always say, if you want good health care, you go to the Catholic, right? Like, they take good care of you. Because our family had, for generations, the big hospital where I grew up in Duluth, Minnesota, is St. Mary's. And so, like, I just had generations of Catholic healthcare providers in my family.
So what have you learned about hospitals' religious directive policies related to miscarriage since your experience, and specifically Catholic hospitals' religious directive policies related to miscarriage?
Yeah. Oh, boy. So essentially, I found out that I was not alone. I know at the time I thought that what happened to me was normal. I thought that, like, that's how all hospitals did things. Shockingly, when I talked to my ex-husband recently, he said he knew that it was not normal, and he did not relay that really to me. But I found out that, like, this happens routinely to people. Like, they don't even give them transfers to other hospitals, even when there's other local hospitals available. that this happens to people who are further along, who actually need emergency abortions to save their lives, even though they say they will do it in the cases of saving the life of a mother. That this even happens in the cases of ectopic pregnancies, that they will fail to terminate in the case of ectopic pregnancies. There is no successful way to salvage an ectopic pregnancy. Like, these are absolutely unconscionable and nonsensical policies, right? There's no medical scientific reason to have these policies in place, and they absolutely don't benefit the health and well-being of their patients. So I found out that this happens all over the country every day, and that Black women and women of color are at more risk of it happening because we have a higher instance of going to Catholic providers.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can you say more about that? How specifically Catholic hospitals and how they will deny access to care that people need, how that specifically impacts women of color and low-income people?
Yeah, so Catholic providers, Catholic hospitals, and Catholic conglomerates have been systematically buying up hospitals and hospital chains, and then sometimes you won't even know that they're a Catholic hospital because they haven't changed the name, right? So say your hospital was just, Jackson Public Hospital or whatever, and the Catholic chain buys it, you might not ever know, and now all of a sudden they're under the ethical and religious directives, and now there's no more sterilization, there's no more birth control, there's no more miscarriage management has been changed, they've changed the way they do end-of-life care, all these things have changed, and no one knows. The community doesn't know, and a lot of these communities are communities that are low income, and they are people of color, and so they're also the only providers, right? So there's nowhere else to go. If you look at the area where I was served, I actually just went back and looked. They are still the only provider in Michigan City, Indiana, and now they have a partnership with the hospital where I could have transferred. So now they've basically locked down the whole area, and Catholic hospitals own pretty much the whole northwest corner of Indiana, except for one hospital in Gary that Gary just fought to keep public, because Catholic hospitals would have locked down that whole corridor. Gary, Indiana is an exceptionally poor, majority Black area that would have locked women of color in that area out of having a public health care provider.
This is a terrifying landscape, and Lori, I thank you so much for sharing your personal story as well as your considerable expertise in reproductive justice issues on this call today. I want to encourage anyone who has questions for Lori to type them into the chat box, and we'll get to that, as many of them as possible at the end. And again, encourage everyone to check out on Rewire the piece that details Lori's story and also gets further into how denial of care at Catholic hospitals in particular is hitting women of color and poor women very hard with regards to the refusal to provide the services that people need in a miscarriage. And I will conclude and pass it to Steph and Pamela by just sharing that, one thing that's been really striking to me is the denial of anti-abortion people in wanting to say that it's never necessary, abortion is never necessary to save a woman's life. I've had Lila Rose from Live Action say that to me before. And there's just a real denial that people need this care, both women as well as anyone who can become pregnant, that people need to be able to access care to end a pregnancy or facilitate the end of a miscarriage. And Savita Halappanavar died in Ireland at 17 weeks pregnant, begging for a life-saving abortion when she was having medical complications. And they told her no, they wouldn't do it because, quote, this is a Catholic country, unquote. So
can I add something?
Please do, yes.
Real quick.
Yeah.
I'm a doula, too. And one of the things I learned over the course of after I became a doula is I was sharing, my mom and I had all these deep conversations about our birth, our birth stories and stuff. And I finally heard the story of my mom's miscarriage before she had her stillbirth. And she was telling the story of how the same Catholic hospital I was born at, sent her home when she was miscarrying, and she did not fully miscarry for another month. Mm-hmm. They made her carry a dead fetus for a month. She could have become toxic until she expelled the fetus. And she said the worst part of it was, because at the time we were evangelical Christians, is that she kept praying and that the church reinforced it, that, a miracle would happen. And she kept thinking that she was feeling fetal movement. So essentially they just tortured her for a month.
Oh, cruel.
So generational, that's what I want to say is that this has happened to generations of women, right? Like, it's not, my mom was white. So, like, I also want to throw that out there. But, like, this has happened to the generations of low-income women and women of color who are low-income, and just women of color across the board, and women across the board have been traumatized by this. And pregnant people across the board have been traumatized by this.
Thank you, Lori. Such important points. And everyone, feel free to chat any questions you have for Lori in the chat box, and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Pamela to lead the next phase of the panel with Steph.
Thank you very much. So it is my pleasure to introduce my dear friend, Steph Perkins. Steph joined Promo as the Southwest Field Organizer way back in 2008 and was the Deputy Director from 2011 to 2015. And then in the fall of 2015, Steph accepted the position of Interim Director of Promo. And in February of 2016, Steph accepted the position as Executive Director. So Steph is originally from Overland Park, Kansas, and comes from a large Jewish family who are also active in their communities. He graduated with a bachelor's in sociology and religious studies from Missouri State, where he was active in student organizing and with the administration on campus. And Steph now lives in St. Louis, yay, with his wife, Amanda. Steph, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So when I was putting this webinar together, I was very, very eager to balance the discussion with an understanding of religious liberty battles that are impacting access to reproductive health care, and then also the religious liberty battles that are impacting access, the intersection of that with LGBTQ rights. And so as the director of Missouri's statewide LGBTQ equality organization, if you could just give an overview for people who are listening to this webinar of what is the state of access and rights in Missouri, and what protections do people have and what protections do they not have?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that we talk about the most is around non-discrimination laws. Mm-hmm. Missouri is one of 28 states that still does not have explicit protections for LGBTQ people in like human rights acts, which means that our state law still says you can be fired, evicted, denied housing, denied access to public accommodations and services just because you're LGBTQ. And so it really limits people's ability to provide for their family, to provide a home, and just gain those like really simple services that we often take for granted when we're just out and about.
And oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and in healthcare, we see this come up a lot. Healthcare, as access to healthcare doesn't explicitly fall under our public accommodations laws, but it's a service that people rely on to, frankly, stay alive. And so many healthcare providers not only are not competent when it comes to care for LGBTQ people, usually exist in spaces where they're exempt from having to learn about it or figure it out.
Thank you for that clarification. So as a Missourian, I just want to make sure that people who are listening to this webinar and are not from the Midwest or the Upper South, or the South in general, understand that lots of Americans live in states just like Missouri or Mississippi. And these are states where you might have one pharmacy or one chiropractor, or one dentist, or one pediatrician. So I think it's important that people understand that this is not an issue that is easily navigated around, and particularly for people who live in the majority of the state of Missouri, that if they encounter discrimination in housing or in public accommodations or in trying to access healthcare, they might not be able to access it at all. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And even when we look at larger cities like St. Louis or Kansas City or Springfield in Missouri, where other states having their kind of top 3 or 4 largest cities, some of those cities still have, as Lori was saying, only one large healthcare provider. Even if you have multiple hospitals you can go to, they may still be under the kind of big umbrella of one individual entity. And even if you do have health insurance, you may be limited in where you're able to use it and where you're able to access it. So just having providers that are competent and taking a compassionate care approach doesn't mean that you're going to have access to those people.
Thank you so much for that. So given that reality, what kinds of religious liberty policies have you seen passing or there's been an attempt to move them and in recent years in Missouri?
Yeah, so I mean, I think like a lot of states that don't already have inclusive non-discrimination laws, we haven't really been a marriage equality organization like we think of when we think of the overall LGBTQ movement. A lot of states, especially red states, as you might call them, we saw marriage equality as a privilege and as something that we hoped for in the future, that is incredibly helpful to people, but that we always used to say marriage is about protecting your stuff. And if you don't have a job, you don't have money to buy stuff. And if you don't have a house, you don't have a place to put your stuff. And if you can't access public services, you can't go get stuff. And so non-discrimination laws are really, really important. And since marriage equality, we've seen this really significant increase in backlash in state legislatures. We've seen a rollback of LGBTQ protections at the federal level. And so much of that has been fueled by this idea of religious freedom and this misuse of religious exemption laws. We saw a big bump in that in 2015, 16, in places like Indiana, where there was kind of this religious right to refuse law, places like Georgia, North Carolina, and in Missouri in 2016, when a bill was attempted to be passed. And if that bill was passed, it would have put actually an amendment in our state constitution that voters would have voted on that would have allowed wedding services, social service providers, and other vendors to deny services to LGBTQ people, and specifically same-sex couples, based on sincerely held religious beliefs. Mm-hmm. And even this session in 2018, we're seeing those very similar bills talking about marriage being only between a man and a woman based on religious beliefs. We're seeing religious refusal bills be filed that would allow crisis pregnancy centers to be exempt from any type of regulation at all based on sincerely held religious beliefs. Cake bakers to be able to deny. And when we talk about cake bakers, it's really important to say that it's not actually about the cake. It's about access to a service that should be and is open to the general public.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. That is such an important point. And as I mentioned earlier, when I was doing the intro to the topic, there's this long history in this country of using religious liberty to deny access to these very same things. So I think it's so important that people understand that this is not some new phenomena. This is the use of a tried and true tactic to deny people access to healthcare, and then specifically, as you said, a backlash to LGBTQ equality advancement. So since I'm a history buff and I love civil rights history, so when I think about some of the most successful ways in which activists and organizers have been able to fight back against creeping regressive policies, I immediately think of local organizing. And even though we think about big movements historically as on a national scale, most of them manifested themselves in Birmingham, in Montgomery, in a local spot. One of the things I love the most about Promo's work, and full disclosure, I'm a longtime fan of Promo, but is that there's been some really cutting edge local organizing that has been done to try to protect LGBTQ people in Missouri, despite the lack of statewide protections. Can you talk about kind of how you came up with, how the organization came up with that tactic, that idea, and then how you went about it and what successes have you had?
Yeah, I mean, I think the foundation of all of the tactics that we use is that people are power, and one person can make a big difference, which means that 10 and 100 and 1,000 and 10,000 can really change the course of history. And finding these tactics to push as many people as possible in the same direction is really important. So figuring out what the problem is, if you can't access healthcare, why can't you access healthcare? What is the challenge that's being put in front of you? Is it that the hospital really wants to help, but the doctors aren't competent and don't know what to do when it comes to LGBTQ people? Is it that the hospital really wants to, but there's this larger entity that's not allowing them to, or so on? And so figuring out really what you want to ask has been really important when we look at strategy, so that everybody is asking for the same thing, even if you're asking it from different angles and with different tactics to increase the pressure, right? And so for an example that I think is relevant here is there's a hospital system here that has locations in St. Louis. It's a Catholic hospital. And there was a situation a couple of years ago where a trans man needed a hysterectomy as part of his transition-related care. His doctor signed off on it. His surgeon was on board. He was being prepped for surgery, like day of, in the bed, being prepped for surgery, moving towards the surgical room, and a surgical nurse stopped it, looked at the file, and called the ethical board.
Oh my goodness.
And so this is, there's absolutely no health-related reason why we need to remove a healthy uterus from this person, regardless of their gender. And it ended up going to the review board. And thanks to this person really being able to advocate for themselves and being willing to advocate for themselves, and support from the community to help him do that, he was able to get through the review board and ultimately change this hospital's policies. But the point here is that those changes are only as good as the people who are in leadership in that moment. Mm-hmm. Because of these large religious exemptions, that means that hospitals at any time can re-exempt themselves from any of these things. And so what we saw was that leadership at the time was really supportive and wrote even journals about how to provide competent care to trans folks and transition-related care to trans folks from a Catholic perspective. But as soon as there was a leadership change, they started to buckle again to the pressure of the archdiocese, and that care has started to be rolled back, because at any time, like I said, they can choose to re-exempt themselves from any of this care. And so it's about consistent ongoing pressure from people knowing exactly what they want, in this case, culturally competent transition-related care and access to that care. but you can't just kind of drop in, make sure it happens, and then leave, because it's always there.
Wow. Wow, that is shocking and at the same time not shocking, if that makes any sense. Thank you for that. So I'm curious about some recent news, and I know that you're not a lawyer, but obviously Promo is watching the cases that are currently at the Missouri State Supreme Court. Can you just let us know kind of what these cases are about and what the potential impact could be on people who are hoping to get some relief from the lack of non-discrimination protection?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one that they heard was the Lampley versus Missouri Human Rights Commission case. And Mr. Lampley was a gay man who was fired from his job, both because of his sexual orientation and sex stereotyping, which is kind of these stereotypes that we make about people's sexual orientation and their gender and their sex, how they dress, how they act, how they talk, how they walk, the names they use, and also who they partner with. So we have these stereotypes in our culture that men are only supposed to be partnered with women and women are only supposed to be partnered with men. And so if a man is partnered with a man, that's breaking this stereotype about one's gender or one's sex, and so it's sex stereotyping. So when this man was fired from his job because of sex stereotyping and because of his sexual orientation is not a protected category under state law. And so he filed a suit in regards to sex stereotyping because of sex discrimination, which is covered in our state discrimination law. Missouri Human Rights Commission said this is not sex discrimination, this is sexual orientation discrimination. That is not within our jurisdiction. The state does not cover that, and they denied to move forward with an investigation. And so he actually sued the Missouri Human Rights Commission and said, you actually should go forward with this. This is sex stereotyping. And so that case is up. There's also a coworker involved in that case on Lampley's side because she was retaliated against for sticking up for him as well. So there's two parties in that case. And so we'll see where that goes. If that's successful, then hopefully more people, both LGBT folks and non-LGBT folks, will be a little bit more protected through sex discrimination. And then the other one is the RMA versus Blue Springs School District. Blue Springs is a suburb of Kansas City, and there's a trans student who was on the football team, on the track team, a trans boy, and he was denied use of the male locker room and the male bathrooms. And so effectively he couldn't participate in sports anymore. Like if you don't have a place to go to the bathroom, you can't be, you can't be places. And if you can't change, you be on the football team. So they gave him a very difficult neutral place to change and go to the bathroom, but it wasn't conducive for him to participate. And so he and his family sued the school district, and it made its way up to the Supreme Court. And they are, gender identity is not included in our non-discrimination laws. And actually our public accommodations laws are really expansive. So for other states, schools may not be included in your public accommodations laws, but in our state they are. And so they sued because of, again, sex discrimination, arguing that this was a male with different physical characteristics than other males at the school, and he was discriminated against because of the difference in his physical characteristics as another boy. And so hopefully, again, if that case is successful, it'll give a lot of relief to students of all sorts of gender identities in our public school system.
Wow. Thank you so much for that very efficient rundown. I really appreciate it. And Steph, if you'll hold on, I know Erin's going to take care of some business, and then we're going to get to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I will take care of that business. And thank you to both Steph and Lori. This has been a fantastic panel discussion. Okay. So you know what to do. Sign up for alerts at www.reproaction.org. We are proud to host these monthly Act and Learn webinars every single month. They are free. They are open to the public. But the only way that you'll be sure to know about them, no matter what, is if you're signed up for our email list. So if you go to www.reproaction.org, right up there in the upper corner is sign up for email. So you can also follow us on social media. We are Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And then also an announcement to save the date for our next Reproaction Act and Learn webinar. We're very excited about next month's topic, which will be disability rights and reproductive justice. I can't wait and hope to see many of you next month. And with that, I'll pass it back to Pamela for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Erin. So our first question is for Steph, and this is a good one. What about when the Satanic Temple fought the state of Missouri's abortion restrictions on behalf of an anonymous woman? The state backed down from its ultrasound requirement in that case, due to that case. So why don't we see other religions fighting back like the Satanic Temple? And why don't we see the AMA taking a stronger stance against incompetent care? And can't there be a restriction on religious liberty as regards to medical care? Great question. And just one point, which is that my understanding is that the state of Missouri lost that case. So they didn't back down, they lost to the Satanic Temple. Steph?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And, I think that the Satanic Temple has a little bit more leeway in being able to do that. Denominations overall, just as a logistic note, are really difficult to organize. And so if you have a full denomination suing on behalf of their denomination, I think it would be really difficult just to organize them. But I think the Satanic Temple has a little bit more leeway and are frankly smaller, just logistically. But I thought it was incredibly creative. And this is the thing here, right? Is like religious freedom actually means religious freedom for all religions and all faiths and all lack of religions and lack of faith. And so, but it's often not enforced that way. It's often enforced by majority religions and the religions of the people in power. And that's, as a person of Jewish faith, my religious freedom is not as protected as some other religions, and that's really frustrating, right? So I think it's a really good question that doesn't have an answer yet as to why other religions aren't doing the same thing. I will make one point on the AMA, is that the AMA and the APA, the American Pediatric Association, I think got that all those letters right, but they both filed an amicus brief on behalf of the trans student in the RMA Blue Springs case. And when we were fighting a bill that restricted trans student usage for bathrooms and locker rooms and other facilities last year in our legislative session, the American Hospital Association and a representative from the APA came and testified against that bill. So I think that is really happening on a local level, and we may just not see it on a really public scale. There was another question in there, and I don't remember what it was.
No, I think you've covered it a lot. But so thank you so much for that. There's a lot of great detail. So this next. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. The competent care part, I think, is important, and part of that is just, frankly, age and access to the education. So. Doctors who've been practicing for decades didn't even have the opportunity to learn about LGBTQ care when they were going to medical school. And in fact, a lot of it would have been things like how homosexuality was included as a psychiatric disease. And so there are like lots of generational issues there. But when you look at current medical school, most doctors are receiving anywhere between only 5 to 10 hours of LGBTQ related care education. And the majority of those hours are being put around HIV and AIDS, which is incredibly important. It just doesn't leave a lot of hours left to talk about transition related care or care around same-sex couples and health disparities there. So there's more work being done in a lot of these states. Missouri Foundation for Health actually funds a lot of health disparity work when it comes to LGBTQ people. So there's more stuff happening. It's just slow, and then it's slow getting out to people.
Yeah, that is so true. That is so true. And I've shared a lot in my writing in a personal capacity about the fact that I had a hysterectomy in 2011. And when I was being treated for over a decade for fibroids and endometriosis, I actually struggled with doctors who would examine me and they'd say, well, you need to have a hysterectomy. And I said, well, I'm not quite sure what the side effects of that might be. And then they're like, well, do you want to have children? And I'd say no. And then they're like, well, what other reason do you have for a uterus? It was the most fascinating conversation to ever have with people. And I know that's a little off topic, but I think it's also these are people who went to school for a long time and were incredibly competent providers on the technical aspect of things. But even in this was more than one doctor was talking to me as if the only discussion on the table was to have children or not have children, and not all of the other things that people think about when they think about our reproductive organs. So I definitely have that T-shirt. So this next question, it's actually, I think it's for both of you. We'll give it to Lori first. So, so just the questioner is interested in state level efforts to make fake clinics. These are sometimes called crisis pregnancy centers, but they're really anti-abortion fake clinics. The answer for reproductive health care gaps, and often used as a justification for defunding Planned Parenthood. Is that something you're dealing with in your state and at the policy level, or is it happening undercover?
So in Mississippi, it's been like stealthily happening. It hasn't been like a huge push because our family, our community-based healthcare centers are already underfunded, so they can't really be like, oh, and by the way, we're already underfunding those community health centers that you all go to, but here's some money for these fake clinics. You understand what I'm saying? So they've been doing this like stealth thing where they give them money for abstinence education or for maternal mortality stuff, that kind of stuff. So which is really funny because maternal mortality rate is high among Black women, but they're not giving any money to Black women or to fight that work. They're giving it to a bunch of old white ladies who have clear disdain and dislike for low-income Black women. Like, they literally dislike us. Like, do not want to mess with us and think that we are lazy, flawed, caught up in a culture of poverty, and every disgusting thing that you could add, the stereotype you could have of Black motherhood, they slap on us, and then they want this to be like the model of care. And then they also give like non-evidence-based information wrapped with a side of Jesus. And then you're supposed to like now make this the substitute for, actual clinics. And then, oh, by the way, you can't go there if you're queer because Jesus. No. So while they've done it stealthily, they haven't been coming out and doing it publicly. And I think part of that is because when they did the religious freedom bill, there was a huge pushback from the public, I think more than they thought they were going to get, right? There was a huge, huge pushback. And even though that law still exists, there was that huge campaign of yes, we are an accepting business, all these businesses slap the stickers on their, there was this huge pushback. And then they also got huge pushback from outside of the state. But I don't think they expected to have the grassroots pushback in the state.
Could you, Lori,
right?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but for our listeners who aren't familiar with that bill, could you just explain what you're talking about in the state of Mississippi?
Yeah, so a couple years ago, Mississippi, because, we're always number one at being 50. We're number one at being last. Mississippi passed a religious freedom bill, and essentially if you have a crappy religious freedom bill coming to your state, it's probably based on ours, because we were like the first one that did the whole giving people the right to have the religious exemption for telling people they can't come to eat at your restaurant, they can't come to your business, you don't have to serve them in healthcare. And it's very broad, right? It's not just, we don't like the gays and the queers, but technically you could basically just say it for anybody. Like, I think you're a whore, so you can't eat here. And because Jesus, so that's what's scary about it. But what came out of that really quick was like, a business owner in Jackson was like, no, and started printing up these stickers for other business owners that were like, we're open and accepting, and we don't discriminate. And like, it blew up into this huge thing statewide. And I don't think Governor Bryant expected to have that happen. Like, I don't think he expected this groundswell of businesses, including Republican businesses, to be slapping great, gay pride colors on their front doors.
That's refreshing that they were surprised by that. So thank you for that explanation. And then I'm curious, actually, I'm going to put Erin on the spot for a second, because Reproaction has, since our founding, we have been working to expose fake clinics and the bad actors that they are. And I think this is a great question, actually, because Erin is heading up our national campaign so I'll just restate it again for you, Erin, that interested in state level efforts to make fake clinics the answer for reproductive health care gaps. And is that something that we're seeing creeping in the states?
Absolutely, and it's something that everyone should be most vigilant about and frankly terrified for. What we have seen over a number of years of efforts from conservatives to defund Planned Parenthood, and I want to be clear that Planned Parenthood is not the only reproductive health care provider in the space. We're also talking about federally funded family planning clinics as well as independent abortion care providers. But regardless, what has been shown consistently is that conservatives have just been, frankly, making things up about what could absorb the patients who would be turned away if these facilities were forced to close or would not be able to accept Medicaid dollars. And so Rewire did an expose on this at one point where it was absolutely bananas. Not only were they listing anti-abortion fake clinics, which in many cases have no medical licensure, no medical person on staff, and really exist for the sole purpose of misleading and shaming people seeking abortion care. But they were also putting in their numbers and counts of, we've got all these different federally qualified health clinics that can absorb it. Dentist offices, okay? Who's going to get a pap smear at a dentist office? They're putting in school nurses in elementary schools. Again, is that where you're going to get assistance with the hysterectomy that you need to affirm your gender, right? So any number of things. And just one thing, while I've got the mic, I realize, Pamela, if I could take a point of personal privilege.
Please do.
I do want to share. I do want to share, as someone who I believe may be the only person on this call who was raised Catholic, and as somebody who was confirmed, as somebody who attended a Catholic university, as someone who is still very active as an alum in my Catholic university, I just want to stress that, and as somebody who's covered these issues for a long time, not just in my activism, but also in my writing, I want to stress that we are really talking about the problem is the all-male Catholic hierarchy and the bishops and the religious directives. It is not the Catholic people. And I think it's really important to draw that distinction, because if you look at polling of the Catholic people, for instance, on the question of reproductive health care, Catholic women use birth control at virtually the same rates as everybody else. Catholic women also have abortions. Catholic people are LGBTQ. I mean, it's so, and the bishops are wildly out of step, and these religious directives are wildly out of step with what Catholic people want. And so I just want to be clear, we do need to name the problem, that these Catholic healthcare institutions and schools are a real problem for discrimination. At the same time, it's not the Catholic people that are the problem.
Thank you for that point of clarification. I'm so glad you did that. And I will take just a moment to talk about specifically about Missouri, where we've been on the ground since 2015. And it is interesting because Missouri is kind of a really good, it's a test kitchen for a lot of bad stuff, but we have the mix of some of the Catholic affiliated crisis pregnancy centers, the anti-abortion fake clinics, and then we do have the evangelical actors, as we call them. And so the exact same thing that I mentioned about having a provider who doesn't necessarily get why somebody would need a hysterectomy or different care other than determining whether or not to have children is something that I think really does creep in when we see people try to position these fake clinics as an alternative, as Erin so beautifully laid out. But when you're in a state that has no protections, no non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people, and you have these fake clinics, that we walk into an environment where they literally have no idea what to do with you when you are LGBTQ, and then they have the ability in some of our smaller communities to make your life hell. So we have seen documentation of people who are LGBTQ, are experiencing a pregnancy, stumble into one of these fake clinics, and then they call your family, they call your church. And again, most people in the Midwest or in the upper and lower South are living in communities where that can be devastating and that can be dangerous. So it's not as simple as whether or not they are a viable replacement as a healthcare provider. They're not, but it's also the reality that they can be a dangerous entity when somebody encounters them and comes out and then puts that in their hands. So we are at time. I would like to thank both of our panelists, Steph Perkins with Promo, Lori Bertram Roberts, who is a force of nature with Mississippi. Thank you both for this incredibly helpful and candid conversation. Really appreciate it. As always, you can reach out to Erin at reproaction.org, Pamela, that's me, at Pamela@reproaction.org. And as always, thank you to my partner in Justice, Erin Matson, for facilitating and helping with another great webinar. Everybody have a fantastic night, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.